Hey, folks, it's Barry Chamish. I've got a great guest. I don't know what to make of this, but we're going to find out. A listener insisted I put him on the show, and I did. And he is R.J. von-Bruening. He has written a book called The Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch. And this, well, he asked, is the story of humanity far older and richer than we believe? And RJ, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All righty. You have, of my listeners, fans. What is this book about?
In a nutshell, it explores the dream vision, which is a little story that's buried in the back of the ancient book of Enoch. And this little story
look, you have to answer. Who was Enoch? And this book of Enoch, why isn't it, scripture of some kind?
Well, actually, the book of Enoch was considered scripture at one time. To back up a little bit here, Enoch is spoken of in the scriptures. Most people know him from the book of Genesis. He's most famously kind of known as the great-grandfather of Noah. For theologians, he's a little bit more interesting in that it speaks that he lived 365 years, he walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. And it's always
what does that mean?
Traditionally, it's been interpreted that he was changed somehow, maybe transmuted, that he never died. He went to go and live with God. It's always been kind of a hazy spot in the theology, but he is unique in that aspect, I think. I've never been able to find anybody else in the scriptures or the tradition that seems to have been taken and changed somehow.
Well, what was inside the book of Enoch?
The book of Enoch itself is an interesting book. Like I said, it was part of the scripture at one time. It was removed around 364 AD, and predominantly in the Western world. And the early church removed it mainly because it gave too much information, in their opinion. The other thing is that it's written.
I have plenty of questions. What do you mean by that? We'll go back to that. Too much information. What does that mean? But go on.
Kind of getting along those lines, that it provided too much information. It basically asked questions that the church didn't want to answer. And one of the most important things is the way it's written. It's written much differently than most of the other texts in the Bible, in that it's written in the first person. And it describes Enoch. Enoch describes having a one-on-one relationship with God himself personally, and the angels, or the host of heaven as he called them. And that, for the early church, was a pretty dangerous idea. And actually the council that removed the book, that was one of the arguments they did use to have it removed from the canon.
They couldn't put it in the third person and include it?
They may have, could have, but it was decided that was more effort than it took. And it also, getting kind of back to that, it provided too much information. It gave information about the fall of the angels. It gave information about the flood that was different than what was accepted at the time. And the church and the council, again at the time, spoke that they didn't really like dealing with this, because they felt that people were coming to the sermons and stuff to hear about the fall of the angels and all these little details, and were missing the greater message to the masses they were trying to spread. So there should have
been 5 books of the New Testament.
Actually, at one time there were a great number of additional books.
I know this one. But Enoch should have been in the New Testament, Volume 5.
I think most people would agree with you, because it has a much more Christian feel to it than the Jewish tradition it comes from.
All righty. Folks, that's a little background. Now, why do you focus on this book?
Actually, it was kind of an accident of how I ended up focusing on this book. After years and years of hearing about it, I finally got my hands on a copy and sat down and had the time to read it. And as I was reading it and getting close to the end, I ran across the dream vision, and that's what I mainly focus on in my book. And the dream vision is simply an allegorical or symbolic retelling of the biblical story that uses animals to represent people and men to represent angels, and it's all overseen by in the story called the Lord of the Sheep. And this story just kind of stopped me in my tracks when I first read it. I'd never heard the biblical story told the way it was, using the animals. The symbolism was just almost overwhelming in it, and it just caught my eye. And as I tried to find out a little bit more about the book, I discovered that there wasn't really much written on it, especially the dream vision itself. It seems to have been kind of overlooked.
And what's the significance of animals and angels?
The big key for it is the symbolism of saying, like, for the animals. It uses animals to represent people. Right in the beginning, where it describes Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, as we typically know it in the canon, it uses bulls and heifers to describe these. I see a great white bull that comes forth from the earth. I see a great white heifer come forth from the earth, Adam and Eve. And the significance here is the symbolism that these first individuals are represented by the bull. And this symbolism is what's important, because the bull means that it represents the first men, the first people. And kept in that story context, eventually these first men are corrupted and fall away from God because of Lucifer's fall from heaven.
All right, I'm a little lost. These bulls are people?
Yes, and it's used in an allegorical sense. They're just used to represent groups of people, instead of, much like how we would use nation states today, to say, I'm an American.
I'm a cow?
Basically.
All right, what the heck?
Yeah, it seems kind of corny in the beginning, and but it is
unbelievable.
But it is well documented and accepted by the theologians that this story is directly related to groups that are represented in the Bible, even though they are represented by animals or groups of animals. But the importance of the symbolism in that is that the bull representing the first men, as told by the dream vision, changes some of the meaning in the rest of the storyline. A good example would be the story of Exodus, of when the Israelites force Aaron to create the golden calf. And then we are told that God and Moses are very wrathful against them, and they slay a number of them. And typically the answer given for the wrath is because they created an idol, and they were idol worshiping. But understanding,
what does Enoch suggest?
And through the dream vision, with understanding that the bull represents the first men, and the first men are the ones that fell away from God, you can understand that the idol of the golden calf has a greater significance than we normally think, because it's not only just an idol, but it's an idol to the first men that fell away from God. So it's kind of an extra insult that's kind of hidden in the story that's been typically lost, because the symbolism and the meaning of the symbolism has been lost over the years.
All right. Now, people, this is obviously a complicated story, argument, whatever. But again, you're saying the dream vision is central to your book, The Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch. Why?
Because the dream vision and the symbolism it contains is the key to unlocking much of the symbolism we see around us today, with probably the most famous one being the all-seeing eye and pyramid that sits on the back of the dollar bill. There's
Okay. That, by the way, is not simple for me. Why? Just what's the importance of the all-seeing eye and the dollar bill?
It's actually tied very deeply into a greater story, but in this context, right now, what I'm getting at is that these symbols all represent a story, and they're all part of a bigger kind of structure. Most people will call it the Illuminati or the New World Order, which is popular on the web. But what it really is more of a hidden religion. It's an esoteric religion. When people wonder what many brotherhoods worship or think, or philosophies like the Masons, which are probably the most famous of all these esoteric groups, that it's not really a brotherhood or fraternity, that it's much more of a religious belief. And they use the symbols from the story that's the core of their religious belief to communicate and to show the story to the world. And it is a very complex subject. Again, the key is understanding where the story comes from, and that it's not a big, huge conspiracy like most people think. It's more of a religion, and that's how it needs to be viewed. That's what's going on at the upper level.
Who exactly is the God in this religion?
That's kind of open, depending on which type of esoteric group you talk to. They do all acknowledge the belief in a creator God, but they have a tendency, in my interpretation, to lean more to the teachings of what the one we call the light bearer, or more popularly known as Lucifer.
He is commonly known as the devil.
Yes.
Well, you have to, don't, just gloss over Lucifer. It seems to be a central point here. I'm not sure. Can you go on a little farther than that?
The big key in a lot of understanding this is that it focuses on the event that we call the fall of Lucifer and his angels. They don't view that as an evil event. They view it more as maybe how the Egyptians would view Ra coming to Earth, or maybe Greek mythology with Zeus coming to Earth. And that's one of the important keys in kind of understanding some of this, is that they tie those other mythologies and stories and believe that they are all connected together in this same event of this being coming down to Earth, and that he eventually imparts knowledge and wisdom and civilization and everything upon humanity.
So that he's a benefactor. The forbidden knowledge of Enoch is that we all believe that someone came from elsewhere and brought us knowledge, right?
In this case, yes. In this interpretation, I try to leave it very open as I write the book, because I just try to kind of present the information and the story, because this is trying to present somebody the Jesus story or the Moses story when you don't really quite understand the religious concepts that are really behind it all.
What are the concepts behind it all?
The biggest part, in my interpretation, would be that there's huge parts of the story that are missing, and that essentially the timeline that we accept for our human history, that most all these events happen in the last 4, 5, 6,000 years, is incorrect. They're actually much older, And this is where it kind of starts overlapping and gets a little bizarre for people because it starts sounding much like the ancient astronaut theory.
Keep it easy. It's not so bizarre. I'm following. All right. So, in other words, knowledge way preceded Christianity or Judaism. It goes back to the time of Enoch, right?
Pretty much.
I'm doing my best here.
Yes, that basically that what we know as the biblical story is actually a history. And this is one of the things that within the esoterics they find interesting and goes back to the symbolism with the dream vision is three of the main characters in it. It speaks of the ox, the bulls that we talked of earlier, these being the first men. Eventually, there's a part in the story where these ox basically beget sheep, and the sheep became the main characters. And this is essentially the 12 tribes of Israel, the story of Jacob, and everything for where it ties into the Bible. And eventually...
You think that's an easy concept?
And then eventually...
You took a very major jump here.
Yes.
And the oxen became sheep who became Israelites. That's not an easy jump.
Well, it's... Well, let me just kind of read the little section here to kind of...
Go ahead. And by the way, you're getting a very, very fair hearing with me. I'm doing my best. That one was tough.
Okay. A great white bull was born among them, and they began to bite one another. And that white bull, which was born amongst them, begat a wild ass and a wild boar with it. This is Isaac, or Esau and Jacob, I believe. I'm kind of screwed up here. I'm jumping in the middle.
It became not a sheep, a donkey, you say.
Yeah. Well, there's a procession here of where you end up with... Okay, I've got to get my notes correct here.
Oh, okay. No.
The wild ass represents Ishmael. The great white bull represents Isaac in the Bible. But that boar, which was born... That bull that was born, which is Isaac, begat a black wild boar and a white sheep. And the former begat many boars, but that white sheep begat 12 sheep. Esau is the white boar. The white sheep represents Jacob, and the 12 sheep represents the 12 tribes, which will eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is a little example within the dream vision of how the symbolism ties directly within to the biblical story using animals instead of people.
But they meant people, didn't they? They were just being illustrative.
No, not really. This is actually an ancient technique. It can actually be traced back to the Library of Alexandria and the Library School of Philosophy. That using allegory and symbolism and using it in this manner is the way to hide stories. This is one of the key points of, like, for the Masonry or within the esoteric. How do they hide the symbols? Actually, a lot of this was very common centuries ago. Back in the medieval age, when people couldn't read and couldn't write, the stories, especially biblical stories and religious stories, were often carved into the cathedrals and to buildings, and that's how the story was told. It was told through the symbols because the people couldn't write. And when we all started to learn how to write, we all kind of basically forgot how to use the symbols and how they were used. But there's still a number of groups that still use them today. The Catholic Church still uses them.
Okay.
Catholicism.
I assume Catholics can read today. Why would they bother with symbols? They can just write down the actual word.
A lot of it is tradition. A lot of it is because they have power. They invoke emotions in people who believe whichever.
All right, give my listeners an example. of a symbol used today by the Catholic Church?
The crucifix.
All right.
It's a very powerful symbol. It has a lot of meaning. It has a lot of legend, a lot of lore that is built up around it. It invokes a emotional response within believers, and it makes an impact that just can't be written out in words. And this goes for a whole host of other symbols too. A chalice will invoke ideas and emotions towards the idea of the Holy Grail and the Last Supper. So the symbolism is important, and it still has an impact even if we don't acknowledge it or aren't even really aware that it's being used, that it's just part of the scene.
I'd say the crucifix we can be aware of, okay?
But imagine seeing the crucifix all the time, but not knowing about any of the stories or any of the lore or mystery or anything about it. And that's kind of the key in understanding with the esoterics and these other kind of mystery religions and groups, that you're seeing their symbols, but you don't know the story behind them, getting all the way back to the triangle and the all-seeing eye. This symbol is actually related back to the event that we call the fall of the angels.
Which is from the book of Enoch.
Right, and also embedded within the tradition, in the biblical tradition, and most monotheistic parts of it believe that there was some fall.
Just to refresh again, if not me, people listening, what fall? Who fell?
Within the esoteric, he's typically remembered as the light bearer or the bringer of light. Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, he's typically remembered as Lucifer. And here in America, the Christians call him Satan. One of the big keys in understanding for the esoterics is they think all these stories and all these different mythologies are all talking about the same event, and that this was a really important event because it was an event that changed the situation, and that understanding this event is the basis of their religious belief.
Okay, now once again, the believer, you're saying people believe in Lucifer?
Oh yes. Yes.
Who?
It varies, and this is where one of those parts where it gets really complex, because there are certain parts of the esoteric religion, like I said before, where Lucifer and Satan and that concept of being evil is not viewed as evil. It's like I said, it's very complex without having to go into the whole rest of the story, which we don't have time to go into.
Well, we're doing pretty good, okay? Don't be shy. As a matter of fact, now look, I'm waiting for a commercial break. I don't see it. So in the meantime, until we get a commercial break, if we do, tell people how to get a hold of your book.
It's available on Amazon.com. It's also available...
I hate to do this to you. RJ von-Bruening, you're going to give your full details. We are getting a commercial. I may even throw in a plug for myself as well. Somehow I fit in this. I'm not sure how, but I'm finding it a very, very fascinating interview. So, folks, in 3 minutes' time, we get RJ von-Bruening explaining, I think this is leading to mystery religions and Lucifer, right?
Right, pretty much.
Oh, good. See you in 3.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188.
Hey folks, we've got a very interesting guest, and I'm working to sort this out. We'll get an understanding of the Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch. First, I'm going to plug myself. All my books are at lulu.com, www.lulu.com. In the search box, spell my last name, Chamish. That'll get you to my books. And David Samron, thanks. My website is barrychamish.com. Now, RJ von-Bruening, plug yourself.
Well, my book's available at Amazon.com under Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch. It's also available at Barnes & Noble and most other online retailers and bookstores. It can also be ordered directly from the publisher, Tate Publishing, at tatepublishing.com. And you can find me on the web at the Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch blog at the Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch.blogspot.com.
If you missed that, we're archived for a week, and that's at libertyarchives.com, and you can catch that again. All right, let's start with your methods. What is archaeoastronomy, and how did you use it to write your book?
Actually, archaeoastronomy is using past movements of the stars to date archaeological events or historical events. Most common is like using a comet or a supernova. In my case, I basically kind of stumbled upon it. It was actually the catalyst that started a whole series of questions. And kind of something I ran across when I was doing my research, I noticed that actually when I was beginning my writing, while I was putting ideas down, I kind of hit a wall. And because in one part of the story, it speaks of a tower, which later on I discovered meant more that it was the temple and citadel of King Solomon. But at the time, I just was thinking a tower, like Tower of Babel or some other tower from history. And I couldn't really think of anything. And after a few days, I remembered some of the ancient astronaut stuff, and I remembered seeing ancient cylinder seals, which are just little cylinder seals with little pictures on them that are typically rolled out on sand. Most of us remember it from some history class. And that there were a lot of images on these things. And I thought, oh, maybe I could use something there to jog my memory or to come up with a new idea. And when I started looking at them, it was really kind of bizarre because I started realizing that there was something familiar about all these images as I'm looking at them on Google, and there's hundreds of them, and that there's a lot of symbolism on it. I noticed a lot of the symbolism was very similar to the symbolism we see today around us, and that there was a lot of animal symbolism on them. And I slowly started making the connection that the cylinder seals appeared to have the dream vision on it, and that
I'm sorry. What vision?
The dream vision of Enoch.
Oh,
using the animal symbolism appeared to be on these artifacts, and on the artifacts also is typically recorded a little drawing of the Pleiades cluster. That's actually visible this time of year.
It's a star cluster in the sky. It's common. Why is that important?
In the case of these, they are typically shown with 7 stars. And I'm an amateur astronomer, and as I looked at these cylinder seals, I noticed that the shape of the way this cluster was recorded kept changing and was recorded differently. And it dawned on me real quick that it was being recorded over time, that they were recording the motions of the stars, and that this could be used to date these events that were recorded. And this is where it gets really crazy for most people, is if you actually sit down and start plotting the stars backwards in time to get the same general shape and position.
How much time? I mean, come on, that star moving?
Yes, prior to 15,000 years ago. That's where it gets crazy.
No, that's actually, I was thinking way more. Okay. All right, Pleiades changes, and you relate that somehow to Enoch.
Because the Pleiades clusters recorded on the cylinder seals and these same artifacts appear to have the dream vision described on them, with the same animals, with the same characters, with the same symbols.
You're saying deliberately.
Deliberately. I think they're the same story, or very, very similar. And that's one of those little pieces that you kind of have a hard time believing that you could be the first one to ever notice that a story that was forgotten about in an old archaic book could have the story that's told on all these little ancient cylinder seals and artifacts that we see around us. And to top it all off, these little ancient cylinder seals have the same esoteric symbolism that we see around us today. It's just a connection between all these different points. And when it's combined as a whole into like Freemasonry or other esoteric groups, you start realizing that it's part of a religion. It's just as complex as the Catholic Church or Judaism, and it is ancient. It is just as old. I would almost make the argument that it's kind of the direct competitor for the more traditional monotheistic religions. The Catholic Church traditionally calls this stuff witchcraft and paganism and occultism, and it's just evil and you're supposed to stay away from it. But at the same time, history tells us that it's the same type of thinking and knowledge that our science and our modern world comes from.
So
this is also
this is leading to another point, directly, that the scope of cultural phenomenon of a new world order, your book provides a true understanding of the depth of this. All right, go ahead. Explain that one.
Because this hidden esoteric religion is what ties it all together. Because one of the key questions for thinking of a new world order or something, and you go onto the internet or you go to the library, you do research, it becomes a little overwhelming and it all seems disconnected, discombobulated from each other. And that was one of my original questions was, if all this stuff is going on, then there has to be something that connects it together. And it appears the way it's connected together is through the symbols and through the story. It's connected by religion. It's not a great conspiracy to take over the world. It's basically a religion that's in competition with everybody else. And this religion basically, in many ways, is exactly the same as any other religion anybody's familiar with. They do have some different concepts on who they follow. They think everybody else is wrong in their viewpoints on the one that fell, and that God may not be the great guy everybody thinks he is.
Hold on. If he's not, who is God?
To them, God is our creator.
Yeah.
He is the creator. To them, he is the creator. He created everything, much along the traditional ways. But he's viewed more as an oppressor. In fact, I was just talking with some friends. We were discussing that, how in our modern culture, especially within the movies and sci-fi, that there's always an idea presented that this big, huge power is this huge oppressive. And we were arguing and debating whether or not this was the esoteric idea, that the big bad guy, the oppressor, is the esoteric representation of God, and the other guy that traditionally is viewed as the bad guy is actually the hero in the story. And that's the idea being kind of presented to people. Whether they agree with it or disagree with it is a totally different story.
Well, no, you're claiming to have written a single understandable story that weaves together all of this. How do you get ancient mysteries and modern conspiracy theories on the same line?
They are tied together through this esoteric religion that's held together by the symbolism based on the dream vision. That's the part that everybody's been missing. That at the heart, the motivation is that there's a religious belief at the core of it all. That's how it's held together. That's how it's transmitted through the ages. That's how it becomes multi-generational. And the wild part is they predominantly hide right out in the open.
Well, you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, if you say the Freemasons, I assume you mean, okay, the Shriners, or there are all kinds of organizations that have beliefs. You're saying they're part of the process?
Yes, they are. And in fact, Masonry and Shriners are a good example. They're all interconnected. To become a Shriner, you have to be a Mason first. Typically, you have to join one core organization before you can join any of the sister organizations. And that's how they're connected together. I always use the structure of the Catholic Church as an example, because you have different sects, you have different breakups. You have the Dominicans, or the Franciscans.
You have all
like
kinds of these separate organizations. You're saying, where are they in this process? What are the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Benedictines? How are they part of this?
They are basic, some of them are unwittingly, but the big key in understanding most all of this is that this is the religion of the elites. We typically here in the States call them the 1% or the 1% of 1%, that at the highest levels and in the oldest bastions of power, they do not follow traditional monotheistic religious belief. They follow esoteric belief. They follow history. They follow spiritualism. They follow a very materialistic kind of viewpoint.
Okay, the current Pope is a Jesuit. This has been noted widely. You're saying he doesn't believe in the Catholic God?
I can't speak for the Pope or the Jesuits themselves. They are definitely an arm of the Catholic Church. I would say he believes in what he says and he teaches. I mean, he is the Pope. But
what does that mean? My goodness.
But you need to understand, too, that what I'm saying is that I'm using the Catholic Church only as an example of the structure and stuff.
Well, you're talking about an entire biblical tradition here,
right,
going back
a couple
thousand years.
But they are one side of the two stories. You have the esoterics, and then you would have the more traditional monotheistic religions. The problem is that the esoteric organization is very similar to the way the Catholic Church is organized, and has many of its roots comes from the church, the early church. This is where it gets kind of really interesting, is it kind of basically goes back to the Crusades, and when the Templars come into contact with the Essenes and Eastern thought.
The Essenes were not in they weren't around during the Crusades. They were knocked out 1,000 years before then.
The Masons argue a different point. In their writings, they claim that they were still around at that time. In fact, they claim a number of groups were still around, and that the Templars were the ones that brought that information back to Europe, which then eventually gave birth to the Renaissance, which is a totally different viewpoint. But it's interesting that within the Masonic writings, that's their claim. Whether or not it's true, I think, is open up to debate, but it's an interesting claim that they make about it.
It defies what common Jewish knowledge. All right, what the heck? All right, the Templars met the Essenes. Did they get along?
Within the Masonic writings and the other esoteric writings I've read, yes, they did. They were fascinated by the information, the knowledge, the rituals that they had. Also, they speak of other groups that they came into, what today we would call them probably fragments of some of the Egyptian thought and Greek thought that was still in the area at the time, and that they gathered up all this information and then eventually brought it back to Europe. There's probably a lot of exaggeration in some of the claims, too, so that should probably be thrown in there.
So Templars are a mystery group.
Yes,
they're not Christians.
Well, they start with Christianity. And see, and that's where it gets bizarre, too, is within the esoteric, as you move up into it, their philosophy starts becoming not Christian, Jew, Muslim, but that each one is part of a greater story. And that's kind of
right. What story is that?
That's getting back to the biblical story, and then the Book of Enoch and the dream vision and the pieces that they claim that are missing from the story. Because one of the big things that they do claim that's very secret and not told to the public is they believe that the big, huge destruction that Christians love calling Armageddon already happened. And not only that it happened, but it happened about 13,000 years ago. That's
before
another
there were Christians?
They actually
kind of predates them.
Well, they shift the entire timeline. They think that events that we think happened 2,000 years ago, they don't think Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. They think it's closer to 13 to 14,000 years ago that he lived. They basically, like I said, it kind of comes back to the ancient astronaut idea. In many ways, they believe there was a
is that? Hold on. What's an ancient astronaut idea? Don't jump too fast. You have to explain these things.
Basically, the modern idea that the gods, angels, messengers that our ancestors spoke of were actually an advanced extraterrestrial species that came to Earth. And like I said, the story kind of gets a little bit like that because the esoterics believe that there was a prior civilization on this planet and that it was two-tiered. One part was highly advanced and one part was very primitive, and that the more advanced one exploited the primitive one, and the primitive part was our ancestry. And that
this sounds paranormal now.
Civilization eventually destroyed itself. They basically bombed themselves back to the Stone Age, which eventually gave rise to our own civilization.
All right, this is paranormal. All right.
Almost. Like I said, it does get crazy, and it does go off onto these other weird little tangents.
By the way, I don't dismiss anything personally. All right. You know what? Tell people how to get your book again. I'm sure there are people out there who will like it. Go for it.
It's available on Amazon.com. It's also available at Barnes & Noble and on most online retailers. It's also available at Walmart.com just in time for Christmas. It can also be ordered directly from the publisher, Tate Publishing, at tatepublishing.com. And I can be found on the net at the Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch blog. That can be found at the Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch.blogspot.com. And I'm also on social networking.
All right. What you're adding, okay, this is your own personal plug. You're providing a radical new interpretation of the entire biblical tradition. Now, that's a mighty big claim. What do you mean by the entire biblical tradition?
Because
go to it.
Because the dream vision itself is the entire biblical tradition from start to finish. Starting with the book of Revelation, or starting with the book of Genesis and ending with the book of Revelations. And it's just kind of a mind-boggling trip down a road that most people have never traveled. And it exposes a better understanding of a mystery religion that most people think is just a crazy conspiracy theory, and that there appears to be a lot of evidence that may back it up.
Like what?
The Pleiades cluster.
We're back to Pleiades.
And relating back to the artifacts, and that there's also that if you use the esoteric storyline and stretch it out over human history that we know of for the last 200,000 years, it appears to possibly fit and give us a generic timeline for where we might want to start looking in the geological record, that we may have missed a few things.
Well, actually, a few 100,000 years, there were Neanderthal, there were a few human species. Things were different back then. How does that fit, into our modern understanding of human evolution? And I'm doing my best here, I really am.
That these ancient stories in the esoteric interpretation seem to be talking about the ones we call Neanderthal, the one we call Cro-Magnon men, our ancestry, that these stories are actually vastly more ancient than we currently think they are.
All right. Again, you lost me there. What does that matter? What do we care?
It has major impacts across the board. It changes our understanding that if that interpretation is correct, that we need to shift our timeline, that our ancestry may have been a little bit more advanced than we think they were.
Starting from when? Which ancestry?
Our most recent one of Cro-Magnon man, which disappeared about 10,000 BC. That many of these biblical stories, if this interpretation is correct, that these stories are actually speaking of him and his time and his peoples instead of us, and just being a couple of thousand years old. Whether or not that's true, I try to leave that open after presenting the evidence in the book to allow the reader to make up their own mind. But it is something that will make you think and wonder.
Well, you're saying that history as we know it, this is very radical, this timeline. You have to admit.
Yes, it is. And I'll be the first one to admit that a lot of this really does sound crazy coming in from
No, I didn't say crazy.
Field.
I said radical.
Well, I'll say crazy.
Oh.
Because some of it does sound crazy when you jump in the middle of it. You kind of have to be led along all the way through and know the whole story. And once you see it and once you know the whole story, then all of a sudden you kind of realize it would be very difficult to talk about this subject, or this seems really out of place, and that it actually does all tie together in one systematic story, going from event A to event B to event C. And that it also ties back into the biblical understanding. It ties into many things that are going on around us today. It is, like I said, a journey down a path that most never wonder about.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I have listeners who will be curious. You've explained yourself very well. In short, what you're saying is humanity's history is way older than what we think.
Yes.
Well, we'll stress that, okay? You're talking about hundreds of thousands of years of, well, what you're saying is smart people doing culturally advanced stuff.
Basically, and that we already know this, that there seems to be a lot of misinformation given to the people over the years, that people know this information and they suppress it and they keep it hidden for their own.
Well, they're not connecting all this together, that's for sure.
At some levels, they do. In the higher levels of the esoteric, in the most advanced degrees of the hidden brotherhoods, they go into this. And in fact, that's how I managed to get some of this information, is from just following them and reading their writings.
The secret societies, you mean? The
yes.
cult.
Is how they're typically referred to.
RJ, I hate to do this because I think we had a terrific conversation, and thank you for it, okay?
Oh, thanks for having me on the show. I enjoy every minute of it.
Oh, I'll send you the link. It's archived for a week. You can get your listeners to listen to it. Folks, this has been RJ von-Bruening, and this is Barry Chamish, and I'll see you next Tuesday. And as for Daisy Stern, you better have a darn good explanation. Night all.
If you'd like to get a copy of this program, you may subscribe at FirstAmendmentRadio.com for only $45 a month, and you'll receive an MP3 CD weekly of all of our programs. As a bonus, we'll send you a password for our audio archives online. That's a $15 value. Or you may request any month of any program on one MP3 CD for a minimum donation of only $25, or any single program on tape, MP3 CD, or CD for only $15. You may do all of this online at FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Just follow the instructions to make a donation or subscribe. You may also adopt an hour of your favorite program Please don't forget that most of the programs on FirstAmendmentRadio.com are listener-supported. Don't do internet? Then call 559-781-3773 and we'll be honored to help you. Thank you from all of us here at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.